All right, so I wanted to talk about some ideas that I had about hell and how, what exactly is hell, and how hell came into creation, or what that creation really means on a philosophical level. So essentially, what hell seems to be representative of is like at its simplest, on its simplest level, hell is pain. Hell is pain and suffering. And it's pain and suffering because we've, as human beings, through a somewhat anthropomorphic way of viewing the world and the things that function in the world, the functions of life itself, the function of the universe, is that we've delegated pain as something that is highly undesirable. And so the essence of hell is it's like the worst place imaginable, with never-ending suffering and torture. And we see it that way because it has to be that way, because suffering is something that we don't want. And, joy and pleasure is something that we do want. So joy and pleasure are associated with heaven. So the ultimate personification of joy and pleasure are heaven, or found in heaven, and the ultimate personification of pain and suffering are found in hell. And so through this anthropomorphic way of viewing these two functions that seem to be polarized and contrasting each other, this is how we come up with these ideas. But essentially what we're doing is we're dividing things that are somewhat, that are actually very necessary. Both pleasure and joy and pain and suffering are vital functions of life forms. And so it's interesting that we've decided that because we have an aversion to suffering and that we want to escape suffering, we imagine that after we die, we can escape suffering if we live nobly and go to a realm of ultimate pleasure and joy. Or if we live horribly, we have to go to a place of ultimate suffering. And so that shows you this human sort of idea that suffering is associated with something that we find evil, essentially. So essentially, what is the personification of evil? Like, what is the force that makes us label something as evil, something that creates a lot of suffering? And so I think as Christianity became less spiritual and more materialistic, and things, the world was viewed as separate from heaven and hell, and that these metaphysical realms exist beyond Earth, whereas Earth is like this inert place where people come to decide the fate of their immortal souls. This has created this idea that not all things in nature are good, that there are some things in nature that are evil, and that there are some things in nature that are divine. But it's like we've divided the world into these two different things. In order to escape what we don't like. And so we've created hell. And essentially, this is like the foundation for things that have followed this more, late Christian view of the world, this lack of unity. Because it's kind of like this idea of good and evil is baked into, I think it's sort of what, that is sort of like the seed that gave rise to political movements that were more secular, because Christianity itself became a more materialistic sort of religion later on in its lifespan. And so the only thing that really remained of Christianity was like this idea of good and evil, and that we should structure the world in a way that reflects good and eliminates evil. And I think this sort of idea is both highly present in both fascism and socialism. This idea, that Hitler had, that we can get rid of all the bad Germans and save all the good to, create a perfect Germany so that only good Germans were allowed to, essentially be alive. And all the bad ones, if we can eliminate those, then we'll essentially have something like a heaven on earth type of situation. And very similarly, in the communist countries, they wanted to essentially eliminate suffering, eliminate power disparities, and create a world where everyone is, no one goes hungry, everyone gets to have fairly pleasant lives and have their basic needs met and all these things, with this idea that we can achieve this by eliminating power disparities and creating equality, which I think overlooks. So I think that it overlooks the necessity of things that we, through an anthropomorphic point of view, label as negative, label as bad, because we try to view the world through an idealism of what human beings find comfortable and easy to manage, instead of viewing the world through a lens of unity, a unity of principles, that the principle of pain and pleasure, that pain is no more evil than pleasure is evil, because both serve a function. And so, it's the quote unquote bad Germans, are as important as the good Germans, because those Germans, serve, all Germans are Germans, and they all function, they all serve a function, and it's all of them are necessary for a healthy nation. And so this is also like where the communists and the socialists kind of fuck things up, is because they're, instead of really creating harmony and recognizing the necessity for inequality, because inequality means you have different organs within the population, and those different organs, different kinds of groups of people, different kinds, I'm using organs to describe like different groups of people who serve different functions, and you sort of need different, you need inequality in order for the society to function well as a whole. And you can't like just get rid of the organs that you think have too much power, because if you get rid of those, then the body dies, because you kind of need those things. But because we like view this world through this good and evil lens, which has sort of came through the inception, came into being in late Christianity, you now create this, what you're doing when you try to eliminate evil, what has been labeled as evil, which is basically suffering in one form or another. The more you fight suffering, the more disharmony you create in the world, and the more suffering has to exist, because you're at war with something, a principle in nature that can't be defeated. And so you're as soon as you say we're going to fight evil and we're going to defeat evil, you're not only are you strengthening the forces that have been labeled evil, which are not evil, but you're but you could say you're reinforcing evil, because those functions of nature now have to constantly remind you of what their purpose is. So the more we fight evil, the more evil screams at us. The more we try to fight pain, the more pain tries to remind us that it exists and that it serves a function. It's kind of like if you have, if you don't have pain, for example, and you're driving down the road, and you don't have the borders of the road. Pain functions essentially like a border. It gives things form. It makes things into a unique shape that recognizes its, respects its physical boundaries in order to survive, essentially, because it needs to know where it begins and where it ends in order to ensure its health and survival. And so by trying to demonize pain and fighting pain, we essentially end up creating more pain and more suffering. The more we try to escape pain, in other words, through comfort seeking and addictions and delusional thinking and avoiding certain truths, the more strong pain grows in the background of our background awareness, and then it becomes more and more all-encompassing, and now we become a prisoner to pain. We started out the war against evil, and now we've strengthened evil to such an extent that now evil is like this. It seems like evil is this overwhelming force and has the upper hand, when in reality, the less we fight evil, the less evil has to grow strong to remind us of the importance that, of the function that it serves. If it serves a vital function that may not be to the tastes of the anthropomorphic human perspective, but it is a vital function that is required in order for existence to exist, essentially, in order for life to exist. The forces of evil are not, evil. They're just something that is there that creates balance within nature. And so if we can accept that these things like pain and suffering, are merely functions of nature and of ourselves and of life, then pain and suffering doesn't have to constantly remind us that it exists. But, when we try to ignore it, then it has to manifest itself in more and more powerful ways to grab our attention. And so fighting against evil is the fastest way to create more evil, to essentially encourage the production of evil. And so, and you can see this in the fascist and communist countries. The hope was to eliminate evil, and what did they create? Greater and greater, misery and suffering and paranoia in the populations that were unlucky enough to live in those countries. So anyway, just wanted to record this. Essentially, the essence is, that heaven and hell, that are, not so much two separate planes of existence. They're sort of, we want to merge heaven and hell and bring them together and look at the world in a more holistic, unified way. That way, there's a greater peace, there's a greater joy in the peace that we can feel if we no longer try to hinge so much of our lives on aversion and trying to avoid the negative. If we can see the negative as merely something that is the essence, part of the essence of life, and it can't be fully separated, then we can live much happier lives, and then we don't have to have essentially our unconscious, creating pain and suffering inside of us in the background of our awareness, and throw things out of balance socially and politically, when we don't recognize that the world has many qualities that we don't necessarily are not necessarily easily able to digest, but to the extent that we can accept those qualities, that will be a great foundation for becoming more whole in ourselves and more at peace with our surroundings and within our internal sort of life experience. Anyhow, so just wanted to record this. You guys have a good one.